Hi, and welcome to the Economics of Reliability. I'm Ryan Sitton, the CEO of Pinnacle Reliability, and today we're going to do some things that we've never done before. We've been putting out the Economics of Reliability reports now for almost a year, and we've covered a number of industries. But during that time, we haven't had a chance to compare across industries. And today, we're going to do that live. A couple of housekeeping things. As we talk through our conversation today, you're going to see a number of people from Pinnacle from different segments of our business, and I'll introduce those in a minute, but we want to give you a chance to ask questions. As you have questions for our group, go into the chat on Zoom and put your questions in there. I'll reach over to our tablet and pull them up and get to your questions as we have time. With me today, I have three folks. Online, coming to us from California, is Ben Dutro. Ben is a manager in our water group who oversees solutions that we provide specifically to wastewater and water treatment facilities. Ben will be talking to us about the water report that we did and specific impacts that he sees from that water report on the water industry. Michael Wallace is with us. Michael Wallace is one of our solutions engineers, and Michael covers specifically our mining operations. So when we are talking to customers about the experiences they have in mining facilities, specifically reliability challenges, Michael is often the person who's leading those conversations. And then, of course, with me is Jeff Krimmel. Jeff is our Chief Strategy Officer, and Jeff oversees all of our market analysis and economic analysis and how we evaluate reliability concerning economics and facility performance. And of course, I'm Ryan Sitton, as I said, and I'll be guiding the discussion today and facilitating how we cover some of the topics that we'll touch on. First of all, I want to ask all of our participants today about key takeaways they had from the reports and specific to those industries. So Ben, I'd like to start with you and talk about the water report. In the water report, one of the things I read that our group had put together was that there was significant opportunity for water facilities to benefit from reliability analysis and how they could use reliability analysis to improve the performance of water facilities. Ben, can you talk about that? What things have you seen and how does that affect what you're doing on the ground and the customers that you talk to?
Yeah, I think the thing that leaped out at me in that report that Jeff put together was not only the breadth of how large that industry is and how much of a gap there is that we need to fill in the reliability space, but also how dissimilar the results were. Everybody's investing in their infrastructure right now, and not all of them are having the same impact with their dollars.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Ben, about the varying impacts, because I think that's a theme that will play out a bit today as we talk about the difference between refining, mining, and water. But Michael, let me give it over to you. One of the things that caught my attention was the amount of money being spent. Now, in our mining report, we covered specifically fertilizer and metals. And in just that segment of mining, those industries are spending $55 billion on reliability, which is more than the entire refining industry.
That's correct. Yeah, we were very surprised by that finding as well. We typically look at reliability through a lens of chemical plants and process safety. And it was surprising to us to realize just the magnitude of reliability spend that's out there within mining operations. Now that covers both mining operations at the mine itself on heavy equipment, shovels, conveyors, drag lines, and at the processing facilities, which tends to be a bit more of a traditional reliability problem to solve. We are finding that both on the reliability at the mine and the reliability at the processing facility, people are spending more and more in order to get that competitive edge.
Well, one thing, and I'll come back to Ben, you and Michael as well, to talk a little bit more, maybe anecdotes about where we're seeing this in specific. But Jeff, let me give it to you. As I read through these reports again, having read through them, of course, when we put them out and now seeing them together, what strikes me is the disparity. It doesn't seem like you wouldn't surprise you at all to learn that these are very segmented industries, because it seems very, very different, almost surprising that these industries aren't learning from each other. What did you see when you go back and compare these things?
That's right. We see each industry sort of having its own journey through reliability. And it's interesting where the similarities land and where the differences land. In the case of petroleum refining, for example, we see the most maturity and sophistication around formalized reliability programs. We see an emergence of maturity around reliability in mining. There's, sort of a fast follower approach from what's been learned in oil and gas. And just we learned the spend intensity within mining is considerably higher than we see in other places, which makes it an interesting problem to solve. In the water and wastewater space, it's exactly what Ben had mentioned, that we see enormous variability across different players in that space, how they define reliability, how they execute against reliability improvement initiatives. So there's a lot of opportunity just from the fragmentation in that space.
Well, Michael, I want to come back to you. What if I think about how much a mine is spending on reliability, and maybe even frame that up a little bit? What if I'm talking in a mine? What things make it reliability spend? And can you speak a little bit, any anecdote that you have, what are those mining operators looking for? What are they trying to achieve with their reliability spend?
Definitely. And with all of this, there's a caveat that each individual metal or fertilizer that you're mining for has slightly different needs, right? A gold and silver mine doesn't operate the same way as a copper mine, doesn't operate the same way as a potash mine. But some of the key themes is trying to make sure, especially nowadays in a very sold out, high margin market, that they don't have any downtime or extended turnarounds and shutdowns. That's a big factor that we're seeing with how do I take my turnaround time and make that into a shorter turnaround? Or how do I make a 3-year downtime that I do every 3 years into every 4 years instead? Because that downtime is just lost production right now.
Ben, if I can, kind of the same question to you. Imagine I'm a water plant manager in Las Vegas. What am I looking for? If I'm talking to you or anybody in the industry about, man, we got to improve reliability. Why is that? And if I'm willing to invest money to go get that reliability, what am I expecting in return for that?
It's a really good question to help define that. The major cost drivers in the water space are energy and labor and process, operations and maintenance costs, all of those things. And it's not reliability isn't just a product that you buy and then are done with. It is a philosophy that has to spread throughout your entire organization. And the earlier you can get that involvement on the design stage, through the construction, through the operations, that's where you'll see the biggest improvement overall. And what you'll see is a reduction in costs and an increase in uptime and availability for the life of your facility. And you asked for an anecdote, and I'll offer one right now. SAC Regional has done just a fantastic job at putting all of those principles into practice. And one of the things that our case study that we're working on right now is going to highlight is that we estimate we've saved them $100 million over the life of their facility by involving our reliability center design and operations team early in their process with their Echo Water plant.
So Ben, it sounds like if I'm reading through that and just trying to get out a big nugget, it is that they're looking for cost reduction a lot. Jeff, as you looked at these industries and worked to establish metrics for reliability, can you talk about that process a little bit, and not only kind of how you thought about it and went through it, but then what results you had, and then finally how those compare across those industries?
Yes, when it comes to reliability, it's an interesting problem to investigate for a number of different reasons. One is it's not so widely reported in the narrow sense. I mean, everyone talks about reliability. Everyone gestures toward there's an enormous amount of capital deployed against solving these reliability challenges. It is difficult to get granular data around spending patterns within each of these industries. So as we did our analysis and our research, we looked for activity drivers that we could use to get a sense of what kind of reliability spend would we predict each of these industries to have. If plants are operating at full capacity, how is that spend levered against that level of activity versus if you start walking it backward from there? So we learned that, like we mentioned when we kicked off the conversation, there's quite a bit of disparity in the intensity of that spend, say for petroleum refining on a per barrel of crude basis of throughput through the refinery. Versus in the world of mining, where what we just talked about was how different the load is if you're mining gold versus silver versus copper versus nickel and so on and so forth, and that you have quite a bit of difference in spend intensity across that domain. And then you get to the water and wastewater space, where each of the plant designs can be very different. On the wastewater side, you're processing to different levels of purity depending on what the end use is. And so there's enormous variability. So it was a pretty deep dive analysis to try to get to an apples to apples understanding across those industries.
All right, so if you are an investor, all right, and you say, I own a certain amount of interest in water, I own a certain amount of interest in mines, and I own a certain amount of interest in refining, all right? All other things being equal, and you've got to go spend $1 on reliability. Who's getting the best return out of that dollar today?
Very interesting question. I would say from what we have learned, the petroleum refining industry is getting the best return off that dollar. It is largely built around the maturity of their reliability programs. There's a, it was largely compliance driven to this point, but because of that initial push, there's been a lot of rigor around understanding what the risk and reward spectrum looks like across that space. So that's where the investments are best targeted. And there's enormous opportunity to follow that same path within mining and water and wastewater.
Okay. So let me take that. And Ben, I want to come back to you because one of the things that I really picked up a lot in the water report was that when you're talking about water providers, we are talking about people that don't have the clear economic incentive that say from a productivity perspective that say a mine or a refinery does. In other words, if I'm a refinery, I'm selling gasoline, jet fuel, naphtha, raffinate, whatever. I'm selling these products on the market and I'm buying the crude oil on the market. And so that margin is my profit. Same thing in mines. I'm running these mines, operating these machines to get this stuff out of the ground. And I'm selling that stuff on the market. And that's where I get my profit. The other day, a water plant is often operated by a municipality. So my question is, if I'm sitting in a water plant today, and I may not be able to look at this like an investor, but I do say, hey, I've got measures I have to hit. We talked about costs already, cost reduction being a big one, but why? In other words, if I'm that water plant manager or that municipality, what's driving me to think about the return on investment for reliability?
Well, in the last 18 months, I think we've all gained a greater appreciation for what critical infrastructure is and what it means to us. And for a plant manager or a city manager, what that means is sustainable operations. The public demands the 100% failure-free operability of their water and wastewater systems. And when there is a failure, it makes national news. I mean, just ask Flint, Michigan. And so the efforts that go into this are huge because it keeps you out of the crosshairs, out of the news, out of the Public Utility Commission's hearings, and allows you to sleep at night knowing that the public can rely on those services that they need.
Okay, so Ben, if I'm one of those water plant managers, and that totally resonates with me, if I'm sitting there worried about, man, if we spend a little bit extra on reliability, that's I want to try to prevent that. But what I hear you saying is, but shutting down has zero acceptability. That is unacceptable. So it would seem that there would be a risk in there that I might overspend on reliability because of the fear of having downtime that's just, from a PR perspective, untenable. Is that right? Do we see overspending in some areas in reaction to that driver? In some areas, yes. Surplus equipment that is purchased without, because of that lack of tolerance for downtime. There's an overspend on equipment that ends up degrading on shelves. Sometimes equipment is then run to failure when it could have been maintained. Some equipment is oversized to try and give capacity, but then induces failures in other areas or just wastes energy and then and incurs higher costs than it should. That's great insight, Ben. Michael, let me come back to you then, because similarly, if I'm in a mine, and one thing that struck me again about the report was the levels of downtime, right? And so obviously downtime is acceptable in a mine to some degree. I'm curious what the mindset is there. So if you're taking this report and you're talking to a mining operator, what things are they thinking about? Because it's not, downtime is unacceptable. Right. So what is it that they're thinking about? Then it's exactly, do you still have the mine there? Their mentality is, I've got this pile of ore that I could get later on. It's not lost production, it's delayed production, right? It's one way of thinking about that. So what happens is frequently these mines will shut down and say, we're going to shut down for X amount of months until the market returns to where we want to start operating again. With that comes unique challenges that are often been overlooked in the past of, what does this cost in my asset lifespan? What is the total cost of my facility?
as a result of me shutting down. Yeah, I'm not turning the ball mill, I'm not turning the sag mill. It's not getting beat up as much right now, but there's still wear and tear on these assets as they corrode and age over time. So kind of like what Ben was talking about with looking at total cost of the plant over the entire life of the plant is something that's now being more figured out into the equation of why are we spending what we're spending? What should we invest in for long-term success? Instead of, can I make it while, make hay while the sun shines, make copper while it's high, and then shut down when it's low. What we also saw was certain mines and certain operations shutting down when profits were low, and that actually increased profitability for these companies overall. So that is a strategic lever these companies can pull. But when they pull that, they need to make sure they're doing that with the right overall health assessment, right? They put the mine to sleep, nothing's going to cause them to wake up in the middle of the night and go, I got to turn this mine back on real quick. That's where we see a lot of the reactionary problems really is from that start and stop, and that manifesting in long-term non-disciplined operations, I guess.
I'd like to hear from all three of you in a way to put this into context. What is the magnitude of opportunity out there? And whatever way you want to talk about that, Ben, Michael, and Jeff, in any of these facilities and across these industries, how big, and I know we talked about this in the report, but maybe you can give it some color. How big is the opportunity? If I'm in refining or I'm in mining or I'm in a water treatment facility, if I turn this into dollars, for example, or gallons or pounds of throughput, whatever, how big is the opportunity that we're talking about here? If everybody achieved an optimal reliability, can you give me a sense of magnitude of that? And Jeff, why don't I start with you, and then we'll come back to Ben and Michael for some anecdotes.
For sure. We use a rule of thumb based on studying the landscape of spend patterns across these three industries, plus the heuristics we've developed by partnering with different operators across all these spaces. There's easily a 10% spend reduction target to be had in terms of just cost avoidance. If you were to sort of optimize a reliability program and get rid of wasted spend, there's at least a 10% bogey out there to go after from that regard. What gets very interesting in a hurry is the size of that prize can get much, much larger than that, but it couples back into macroeconomic conditions because there's the opportunity cost of not running at full capacity. In depressed economic conditions, maybe that opportunity cost isn't so great. But when you're in a macroeconomic condition like we are today, where there's a recovery that's taking off and we expect more growth going forward, that opportunity cost becomes greater and greater. And that one can be much more difficult to quantify because it depends on the commodity or whatever fluid or materials being processed. But that's where the real dollars are out there to be had. So conservatively, at least 10% of what's spent today is clearly spent suboptimally based on just studying the patterns across these industries. And the size of that price grows considerably from there.
One thing might be good to pause for a second, talk about exactly the buckets in case folks haven't read the reports. When we think about reliability in these reports, we are talking about everything that is spent to keep a facility operating. So that's maintenance spend, it's investments, not capital, but any investments to upgrade for a reliability purpose. It's reliability spend, inspection, all of that is included, right? And that's a consistent metric that we use across all these industries. So if you're using, I think in maybe in the refining report, if I remember right, that an average refinery out there is easily spending, a small refinery is probably spending 10 to 20 million a year on those costs. When you're talking 10%, you're talking 2 million plus in a small facility. You get up to large ones, you're talking maybe upwards of 10 or $15 million of savings annually to be achieved in some of these industries.
That's right, just on the cost avoidance side.
Just on cost avoidance, not counting increased throughput. Michael, when you are taking this into specific customers, does that number ring true? Or are they seeing, oh man, we could save 10, 20, 30 million dollars either on the cost avoidance, or man, if we upped our throughput, we could get another 10, 20, 30 million dollars worth of value?
Yeah, and it's a great way to look at it. If you're looking at refiners versus mines, it's almost the inverse side of the coin. It's not so much how can I save costs? It's where should I start investing more into to get those lack of downtimes? How can I get more throughput? How can I make sure this doesn't shut down? So what we're seeing is in the order of, if you were to increase your throughput by 5% at the mine, mine we're working with, you could see an order of $300 million of return from something to the tune of $2 to $3 million worth of the right investments, if it all pans out. Now, of course, there's a lot of unknowns because new technologies haven't quite been implemented to see exactly where to pinpoint those failures and where they would manifest. But what we're seeing is massive ability to turn a small investment into a large return at these plants. The question is where to go spend.
Okay. Well, Ben, coming back to you, and another anecdote that I do see across these industries, there are, Jeff, 130 refineries, give or take, in North America, the United States. Water treatment plants, there are 20,000.
Yes,
20,000.
Yeah.
So Ben, recognizing we're talking about a different scale here. If you said, well, we're only going to make $1 million in the average water treatment plant, on the whole, that's even more money than you'd make in the average refinery. But I am curious, Ben, when you hear these type of numbers, does that ring true with you as well? Do wastewater treatment plants, understanding it's an order of magnitude smaller on a per facility basis, but on the whole, when people say, man, there is $5-10 million worth of cost avoidance, maybe across a handful of water treatment facilities, does that resonate with you? You mentioned the Sac Regional example. That was on a capital expansion, I think. What about on sustained operations? Do you see those same dollars?
Yes, yes, and it does scale with the size of those facilities too. For example, an operator that we're working with right now has realized that they're losing 25 to 30% of their potable water to leak loss. That's water that they've already pumped, treated, made potable, put into their distribution system, and now can't monetize it. And we're working to stem those leak losses right now. And that's just, that's not only is that a service loss, but it's also revenue loss. And so addressing those simultaneously, you get a big bang for your buck there addressing those.
I wanted to jump in on one of Ben's earlier comments when he was talking about the excess capital spent that, say, water and wastewater treatment operators will incur in order to have, say, sufficient spare capacity so they never go down. That's a problem that we see in a more exaggerated form in water and wastewater. It's a problem that exists in all reliability domains. And it's something, it was a motivation for us to build these reports in the first place, was to understand that this reliability challenge is spread pretty interestingly across the operating domain and then the capital investment domain. It's easy to bucketize reliability and just think, okay, that's a cost. It's basically a tax for me to run my facility at full speed. But that misses half the equation, which is if we don't optimize the spend over here, we end up having to overinvest in the facility to account for the fact that we have these failures that we could otherwise manage if we were more, if we took more prep time upstream of that failure. So it's a theme that we see across these different sectors. It's a theme that motivated us to do this kind of research. We see it most prevalently in water and wastewater operations, but that's another area, in addition to cost avoidance, in addition to the opportunity cost recapture, having your plant operate at great levels. There's this third very important bucket, which is the optimized capital program that you can execute on the back of an optimized reliability program. And there are big wins to be had in all three of those buckets.
If I can jump in on that. I know we were looking at the graph for what does mining industry from capital and cash flow look like for the past 5 years? And we saw a big slump back in 2015, 2016, kind of when that actually hit. And what we were talking with some of our mining customers, they were explaining how we are still paying the maintenance debt for that lack of investment 5 to 6 years ago. And it's just now coming, the cattle are coming home, basically. It's how do we make sure that we've understood and evaluated exactly how much that is going to cost us in the long run, and then say, look, we didn't spend it then, we're going to have to spend twice as much now to make up for it.
Do you shift gears a little bit? Let's talk about the last year and a half. March of 2020, COVID starts, just quickly going around the country. Everybody's reacting and trying to figure out what to do. And of course, we saw some really bizarre things happen. We saw the price of oil go to negative $37 a barrel because the empty space in a tank was worth more than the oil to fill it, right? Mm-hmm. Just things we'd never considered before. Across these industries, water, mining, and refining, what impact did COVID have? And whether that's an economic impact, it's a material reliability impact, it's just an emotional impact. What did we see? And Ben, let's start with you. What did you see across the water space when it came to the last year and a half of COVID reaction, lockdowns, government programs, that sort of thing? Operators
rely on contractors in many cases to do some of their functions, and those just weren't available. There were big staffing shortages. There was a lack of maintenance being performed. There have been accelerated failures. There have been process upsets as the influent quality has changed dramatically. There have been pipelines that have seen corrosion they never expected to see because of reductions in load, because of all the upsets in where people are living and working and using these facilities. And it's been there's been some great opportunities, but some huge challenges as well.
Thanks, Ben. Michael, how about you? What have you seen in the COVID reaction?
Yeah, so there's, the mining industry and the metals especially, you've seen a lot of actual booms due to increased expectations for electric vehicles and kind of cities of the future. Lots of different commodity wars going on between Australia versus Chinese steel. And as each of these countries' total outputs are maybe reducing due to shorter staff or uncertainty in their production due to COVID, you're seeing a lot of fluctuations in what's the value of getting a stable operation going. So the economics change at a macro level in a significant way. I'll let Jeff, the expert here, take more on that. At a more micro scale at these facilities, we're seeing, and at any facilities, not just mining, when we want to invest in a program initiative or an improvement project, or we want to go put on some new sensors or something like that, those types of projects were maybe planned and budgeted for 2020 early on, and a lot of things got delayed or the plug pulled on them while we were in uncertain times. We're just now seeing the tail end of that. People are starting to get budgets going again and saying, I want to get my plant healthy again. I think this plant's going to last another decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. But for a little while there, it was, let's just try and get what we can out of these equipment so that we can keep everything solvent.
Jeff?
Yeah, on the petroleum refining side, we really saw it being the tip of the spear when it came to the demand destruction that we saw globally. When you have these lockdowns and collapse in global mobility, you really saw the petroleum refiners take it on the chin. And it was time then to sort of reconfigure and think through, what does the recovery look like? What does the transition look like in terms of when that mobility reemerges? What is the energy landscape? How is it shifting? And how can these refiners position themselves accordingly? So it was a time for upheaval like the rest of the economy saw, but I think that the pain was probably more acutely felt in that sector, and it was felt most immediately in that sector relative to the others that we studied.
So if I'm thinking about the lesson maybe to learn from COVID, right? The lockdowns forced us to think short term is what I hear everybody saying, right? Contractors aren't in the plant, I can't do that work. Man, the economics aren't working right now, I can't do that work. Man, there's just nowhere to put our product. So why focus on reliability when I don't even know if I want to run this thing? It brings up an interesting challenge. And I realize I'm going to ask to everyone here to play psychologist, right? I'm a manager in a water facility or in a mining facility or in a refinery or any other industry, a wood mill or a chemical plant. How do I balance what advice would you give me in balancing reliability, which is what I hear you saying is for the most part long-term, or do you challenge that and say it's not? How do I balance thinking reliability, thinking long-term with short-term objectives? Mm-hmm. Once again, I get you're playing a little psychology here with the plant manager, but what do you say to that? Michael, let's start with you. If I'm the mining guy, okay, thinking short-term, long-term, how do you have that conversation?
Yeah, definitely. And mines, for the most part, have the benefit of trying to establish a mine life. So there is a certain, I need this thing to run till 2035, 2045. So that's in the back of your mind when you're doing that equation already. But really looking at what is the dollars and cents impact of the health of this asset going down, and what's the risk I'm maintaining on a daily basis with that piece of equipment. Given that, do I make sure that my operations that are mostly focused on production and daily numbers understand what they're doing from a reliability standpoint? I think more so, and maybe Ben can speak to the water side of things, but in mining, the fluctuation that you can have on how much you push through an asset versus degrade that asset is a lot of freedom towards what you want to do. Whereas refining, there's chemical limitations, there's more design limitations. You can't break the assets by trying to squeeze too much out of them too fast. On mining, you can't. If you want to make 50% more production, you can do that. You need to understand the trade-offs that costs for, do I need to replace this equipment that much sooner? When you're in a very sold out market, that might be worthwhile. And having the data in front of you to see, I want to run this 50% harder, that will relate into this many years less asset life. And I can be okay with that. Or no, I can't make that assumption. I can't make that risk. Let's stick with the current operations where they are.
Okay.
Having that data in front of you, I think, will be the thing that the plant manager would want to do to get different swim lanes of his operation be sweeping the same way, his or hers.
Ben, similar question. If I'm in the water industry, how are you navigating, or how are the customers you're dealing with navigating the idea of short-term objectives, lower rates, whatever reliability issues, cost control with long-term reliability investments?
I'd say so that disparity that we talked about at the beginning of this, where there's a wide variety of maturity levels throughout the different organizations and facilities. I'd say that operators like the one I mentioned earlier, that's just losing potable water through leaks. That's an immediate, right now, has to be addressed reliability issue that we're helping solve immediately. More advanced clients that have invested in their data and their assets are able to make those longer term strategic moves that will help them save money and improve uptime over the long haul, the decades long schedule. And I'm willing to bet that no matter who we're talking to, we can find somewhere on that continuum that we can help you solve some problems immediately and long term.
Jeff, any thoughts on this, the short versus long-term focus?
Yes, we have seen this be a trend in the continuing evolution of reliability thought across the complex process domain. Sort of the most naive approach to reliability is a very reactive approach. If something breaks, we'll fix it, get it back working. Many industries, right, have pushed pretty aggressively into trying to predict when these failures will occur and perform, maintenance in advance of that. So it's a less costly endeavor when something bad otherwise would have happened. We see a continued push along that trajectory where we try to be more thoughtful, more forward-looking, and more holistic around how we think about reliability. So we've seen what I would counsel a plant manager in this case to do is to think deeply around and to assess the data that's currently available, the modeling capabilities that are increasingly available, and how can we make sure we best understand the impact that reliability has on plant performance today, plant performance going forward, and how that then couples into these capital investments that we were talking about. Because in many cases, we'll end up over-investing in assets to correct problems that we could have corrected if we'd had a more holistic review of reliability in the first place. So there is a much more long-term thinking involved with it and a much more data-driven, more analytically heavy approach that I think will be necessary going forward.
Well, let's lean into that. Now we have a question that came in from Ellen Riley. I want to take this question, then I want to talk about challenges because you've both mentioned, in fact, all three of you have mentioned getting things in front of people to make decisions, right? And what I hear is just like at home, if I'm trying to make a decision about something in my personal life, if left to my own devices, I'm going to be biased towards the immediate thing, sort of biased towards reaction, but given more information, given more data, it helps paint that picture. So we'll come back to this. Ellen asks, how does the type of reliability opportunities, i.e. equipment, investment, procedures, inspection, and monitoring vary across industries? Now, Ben, Mike, I'll let you guys weigh into this if you can, and as you've seen in other industries. But Jeff, let me start with you. Do you see, can you quantify that based on our analysis?
So the short answer is no. I wouldn't go to a specific set of numbers that say, investment, equipment investment versus procedures versus inspection and monitoring. What I would say is there is almost certainly enormous opportunity across each of those buckets. And it certainly varies industry to industry. And as we've learned, operator to operator, there's a ton of variability. So what makes it interesting, right? That can sound very frustrating to think, oh man, it's all over the place when it comes to this challenge. And in a sense, there is. But in a sense, that's part of the reason there is such enormous opportunity to pursue these reliability improvements is there is a special snowflake element to this where every operator really is living a different journey through the world of reliability than the others. There are themes that are shared across these. There are data sets that can be used to solve these kinds of problems in a more universal sense. But no, there's a ton of variability in there. And that's part of the challenge. It's part of the reason, frankly, this problem hasn't been solved before now, is there's so much fragmentation and non-uniformity in these problem sets across industries, within industries, that it makes it a pretty interesting challenge.
Jeff, what I hear you saying is, no, we don't have an answer to this question specifically. And I couldn't even answer it within the industries. You could go into refining and say, we see some refiners spending a ton on inspection and a ton on sensors, not that much on maintenance. And then the others, man, they spend a ton on maintenance, not doing a lot of inspection. I kind of anticipate that. Michael, you've spent time, not just in mining, but across other industries. You speak to some anecdotes here. I mean, what have you seen? Are you seeing this wide variability and anything specific that has stuck out to you?
Yeah, definitely. Both within industry to industry and within mining industry specifically. I'll pick on phosphates. It's where I got my start. Most of the costs and justifications for inspections just aren't there, because if you have a loss of containment at a phosphate concentrate facility, it's mostly water and rocks that come out, and it's usually small quantities, and the cost of a spill is not that much, and the environmental impact's not that much, and the safety impacts, depends on the asset. So the preventive on that side is very low on spend versus sacrificial maintenance on liners and replacing components. It's just a different paradigm, that the way that they're setting up, what do we want to go spend on? I'd rather fix it. I'd rather plan to fix a lot of things than prevent a fix here and there, because we know that that's what's going to happen to the assets anyway. It's just a matter of time. And then on the flip side, you've got assets where there might be a lot more chemical processing or smelting or refining going on with these metals, that maybe a copper or an aluminum mine. And within those processes, you have a lot higher problems of, if we don't catch this before it breaks, you're going to have a massive amount of environmental pollution and lost production costs because of the nature of the amount of throughput that they have. So just that proactive versus reactive scale or slider alone, even within mining, is huge. Loss of containment on event on a gold dust product line is huge. You can imagine, you lose one ring worth of gold, that's a couple $100. You lose one ring worth of aluminum, that's a fork. Nobody cares. So you can see how that changes mindsets within mining. Now, comparing mining to other industries, there is a similar focus in both about how do I affect my data that's coming in through better monitoring practices. I think monitoring is the one where we're getting a lot more insights from everybody. How do I spend on something that doesn't require a person to go out there and I can get that data coming into me? Because I think everybody's seeing that kind of digitalization, digital revolution, data of the future. And I'm seeing that everywhere, not in any individual swim lane or industry. I will say probably refining is a bit ahead of the others. So they've been doing it for maybe longer. They've had a bit more cutting edge technologies, whereas the other industries are playing catch up. But it's all there. Everybody wants to be able to have more confidence and control about what's going to happen in their plant according to those snowflake strategies. Nobody wants their snowflake to melt.
Ben, anything to add to this? I mean, it seems the theme is, not just is there disparity across industries, but even within the industries. And I would assume the little bit of time I've spent in water that given the massive disparity in size, I think unlike mining and refining, you're dealing with literally some water plants that are 1,000 times the size of others in terms of throughput. Do you see the same thing? There's just, people are just all over the map on this?
Yeah, and I guess I'd ask Ellen, which was a great question, but I'd say you just have to rank by industry and application what your risk factors are, and characterize those and rank them. What's the most important thing that you need to address? If a water pipe breaks, it's much less hazardous than in a refinery. But at the same time, you can't have systems going down or having people get cut off from their services. So I just say the risk and the consequence of failure analyses that we do are kind of the primary driver for where we choose to attack those issues.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears and talk about challenges. I mean, let's face it. If you're sitting out, anybody who's probably watching this, who's got familiarity with the space, they say, okay, so you're trying to lower cost and you're trying to maximize throughput, duh, right? I mean, we get it. What today are the challenges then? If everybody knows that, if that's the way to make a large, complex facility more profitable, more sustainable is through reliability, then what's keeping people from taking that leap? Ben, if it's okay, I'll come right back to you. If I'm the average water plant out there, what do you think is keeping people from taking that step? If we know this is what we need to do, why aren't people moving forward? What's in their way?
These reliability efforts are pretty large. It's no joke, and I think we've seen some efforts have been placed into that historically. They've gone to a conference. They've hired a consultant to come in. They've put some effort in, but the follow through is where I think there's some stutter steps and some missed opportunities. They haven't got to all of their documentation being evergreen. All of their data inflows are not all being looked at the same way. And so at the programmatic, there's an effort at starting that, but then the follow through is kind of missed sometimes. And so many times when we're working with operators, we see that they've tried and maybe have fallen down at some point along the way.
So Ben, what I hear you saying is they see the opportunity and they're even beginning to to construct a dynamic in which they could make those improvements, but making that decision to go spend the larger effort, the bigger dollars, it's just a hurdle to get over. Man, are we sure that we will get the return on this in a way we can validate to our ratepayers, if you will?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the main driver on why they may have stalled out or haven't followed through completely, is they have struggled to measure those improvements. What's the return on this investment? And sometimes you can stop maintaining equipment and realize some savings in your operations right away, but that longer term, it will bite you eventually. And that's, I think they've started it, they've gotten partway down there, but they're struggling to measure the benefits.
Michael, I'll go to you. You talked about these massive dollar amounts. Man, we can get 5% more throughput, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, I hear that and I go, it can't be that big, because otherwise they would do it. What's the hurdle again? Why not make those moves immediately?
Yeah, so this is obviously going to vary a lot from person to person or company to company. But I think when we're looking at the 2015 downturn to now, there's some layoffs, some industry, headcount reductions, things like that. And what we're seeing anecdotally is that a lot of our staff have not come back up to the levels they were even before that downturn. And so these teams, reliability teams, operations teams, even site leadership that may need to be playing whack-a-mole with how do I make sure I focus on keeping this thing running, instead of how do I focus or get my head up for air to look at something proactive, right? They are understaffed and maybe can't see past the next couple of downtimes, or that one turnaround's taking all their attention. So nobody's able to really pay attention to this other thing. The dollars make sense. Everybody says, yeah, I get it. I feel that way. Come back to me when I've got my plant under control. And it's one of those vicious cycles where if you're able to stop for a couple months and invest in something, a year later, you'll have better control of everything. But to get to that point of freedom takes a bit more investment and focus. Another way I think you can get through that is getting these different teams to realize that they're working towards common goals instead of everybody focusing on just their own individual areas, and bubbling that up to management, plant leadership, corporate governance, and say, we do need one extra person to facilitate this discussion between us, or I need 3 more reliability engineers like we used to have before, because they were able to make sure that the next 5 years work, not just the next 5 months.
Jumping on this idea of corporate level leadership, Jeff, one of the things I love hearing from you is when you sit on these analyst calls, right? So, and for those who don't know, Jeff, when he is doing these market reports, he does listen to the big companies and small companies, I guess, publicly traded companies, when they're sharing insights across these areas. Jeff is listening and he's participating to get some insights there. How do these kind of conversations bubble up from the water plant to the mining plant or the refinery up to the CEOs and leadership teams? How are they talking about this? And once again, if I'm the CEO of a publicly traded company, I assume the shareholders want better share prices, they want dividends. So why not? What are they doing, or how are they thinking about reliability?
Yes, I think it's a great question. That the way that it bubbles up most directly is in the form of capital programs. There's some sense of what sort of capital investments required today in order to sustain operations going forward, and then what element of capital is required to grow the business from there. Reliability plays pretty deeply into that aspect to better understand what do we have to spend to maintain existing operations versus invest to grow the business from here. That's the most direct way that reliability is articulated at that level of the organization. And one challenge in order to allow reliability, the conversation around reliability, to percolate up to that level in the right form that I see, to call back to an earlier question, is around the fragmentation in the broader approach to reliability across industries. Within the domain of reliability practitioners, there's an alphabet soup of credentials and approaches and tools and metrics, and so there's enormous expertise within each of these silos. We have seen that the most sophisticated, the most valuable thinking in the reliability space tends to be that which marries across these silos. And that's the first step. If you can really start to take data that you collect in one domain and use it to improve your decision-making across different domains, the value starts to compound in a hurry. It gets to what Michael was talking about, that in many cases, the most attractive element of the return on that investment is farther forward in the future. And that competes against urgent uses of capital today, which every business will always have urgent uses of capital today. So it's tough to try to protect that investment that you want to make in reliability to capture these longer term investments. But you're exactly right that that's the charge of the C-suite for each of these entities. And that's the real challenge, is to try to shepherd these resources in a way that generates the most long-term value, knowing there's always these urgencies that emerge that in many cases compete pretty attractively against capital for reliability in unfortunate ways.
You mentioned something there about the ability to take information from other places, pull it together to make these more informed decisions. Digital transformation has become the kind of buzzword of the last 5 years. And we're hearing it in everything from healthcare to transportation to how you get your pizza. I feel like what I hear a lot when I'm at trade shows or interacting with customers is, yes, digital transformation is real. Our company is investing in it. And then kind of quietly, they're like, but it's really a bunch of baloney. I mean, there seems to be this dichotomy that people at the plants feel like it's going to be a lot of dollars thrown at things and a lack of real value. My question, because Michael, earlier, you talked about access to data and using data to make these decisions. Ben, you've talked about how people are thinking about things and what things are popping up on lists and urgency. So my question is, in the world of reliability and digital transformation, if you want to use that term, access to data, whatever, where is the future there? What are we seeing in terms of customers who are doing those things, or whether they're Pinnacle customers or just people out in the space, industry players, leaders? What kind of value is popping up out there associated with access to data and pivoting these programs into this digital transformation? Michael?
Yeah, so this is, again, a bit of anecdotes, but what we've seen when we're talking with customers and we're talking with people we want to collaborate with about, do you have your information ready? And they say, well, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. And it almost seems like initiative overload, like you're talking about. We're trying to get all these things together, and each of the things that they're getting together don't necessarily speak to the same end value case. Some of them are, hey, I'm able to reduce my headcount because I'm able to make a decision through a computer that used to take me 5 people for a year, and I can use 2 or 3 people doing those same analytics. So that's one way that you can get that information. But you also have to front load that, where you're combing through that information to put that into place. What we're seeing is the amount of different initiatives, back to my previous comment about headcount and staff availability in the mining space, is they want to make sure that any investment they do is as low touch as possible with the team, so that it's not spend all this time we could have done in the past of getting information together, big backlogs of information to get it to our fingertips, to make the same kind of decisions we used to be able to make off the cuff based on gut feel. Now, that gut feel, that tribal knowledge, as we get younger workforce and people aging out and lots of replacements and kind of just with COVID, all kinds of different labor shortages, the ability to have that digital information stored in a single place with the same analytics and the same lens is invaluable for codifying that tribal knowledge, or that, this is how Joe, the maintenance guy, used to do things for 50 years, and now it's in a report. And now we can automate and tweak that from there, instead of going, once Joe leaves, nobody knows how to do this anymore. Right? So I think you see that with the digitization of any information. The more advanced things like machine learning, you're getting to see some elements where we're now to a point where we're seeing things that maybe the human analysis couldn't have caught before. Oh man, our pressure spiked a little bit right there. What does that mean? Well, it turns out that meant that this failure you had a couple of years ago, it had the same pattern to it. Now we're able to learn that moving forward, whereas something human wouldn't have caught a decade ago. So cool things, but also want to make sure that there's focus on the right things from a value standpoint.
Ben, are you seeing folks in the water space experiencing success with digital transformation when it comes to reliability, or are they still behind that curve?
They're further behind than the mining and the petroleum industry for sure, but they're starting to see some of the same values. So there's live pipeline monitoring right now can detect water theft versus leaks and differentiate between the two and provide real-time feedback where it would not have been transparent before. The operator, what you just said, Michael, definitely resonates in the water industry as well. There's a lot of tribal knowledge among certain operators at different facilities, and being able to record those practices and schedules and have everyone take care of equipment the same way on the same time is a big step in the right direction. We're definitely seeing some of that.
Jeff, any insight on this question about digital transformation? I know I've heard you talk about, and when I'm on these analyst calls, certainly these CEOs, these leaders, that's in the dialogue somewhere. Do you get that they're seeing it? We've made some investments. We're getting data into this reliability program. Can we make those connections or not yet?
Painting with a broad brush, I would say not yet. What's interesting is, the more that I've read and heard about digital transformation, you kind of get to this, say first order thinking, which is, everyone needs to digitize. It's increasingly costly and increasingly disadvantageous to try to run a business using analog means and methods and workflows. So there's this necessity around digitizing. So in a sense, it almost seems like table stakes. And if everyone's doing it, then how could I possibly capture some competitive advantage around digitizing? Like that's sort of a first order approach, and it's sort of the default approach until I feel like, having been exposed to more sophisticated thinkers around digital transformation, that second order approach to thinking is that there's sort of countless opportunities for competitive advantage embedded in this, any particular path down digital transformation that any operator may choose to follow. Our argument is, having surveyed this reliability landscape the way we have, there's enormous opportunity to be had in establishing competitive advantage around digitizing within reliability, because so many of the barriers at this point are built around silos that necessarily had to exist in the analog world that no longer are necessary in this new digital landscape. And so harvesting that data, analyzing it across, certainly at the level of a whole facility, but even a portfolio of assets, and using that to optimize decision-making, both in the day-to-day running of those facilities and in designing investment programs about how to maintain and grow that base going forward. There's incredible opportunity there. I don't sense that the industry writ large has completely wrapped its arms around that possibility. But every quarter, frankly, you're seeing a little more constructive conversation, a little more clarity around what this means. And so it's clear that's the direction things are moving, but we're not there yet.
Well, let's do this.
I was going to just piggyback off that. One quick comment. You got my mind thing. Clarity, I think, is really the word that we're getting towards here. And that's I like to use this analogy a lot of. Everything we've done today has been, I have a goal, I have a production target, I have a budget, and I have my assets where they are today and what they've done in the past. Really getting in that future of, what do I have a crystal ball to? What can I look in and say, what do I think the next year is going to be with that data that's feeding into it? And having that roll up from multiple facilities, multiple departments, multiple enterprises, all the way up to the top, and saying, here's what we think is going to happen because of these data points, and this is how well we performed against that, as opposed to, here's what we think is going to happen because that's what we did last year.
Well, we're going to have one more question today, but I was about to say, if you've got questions, be sending them in. I see we got one in the chat, and we'll go to this question, but then afterwards, our final question we're going to talk about today is Ben, Michael, Jeff, and I'm going to answer my own question, which is, if I'm inside a facility, what's the first step? Give me a recommendation. Where can I start down this journey, looking at it, the economics of reliability? If I need to go to my boss or my boss's boss or VP, and I'm talking about investing in reliability, where do I start? But before that, let's take Greg Weber's question. How do I integrate reliability considerations when needing to make rapid/radical changes in production, rates, feedstock, products, et cetera, as demand changes and fewer assets remain operating? So back to it. How do I integrate reliability considerations when needing to make all of these things on a rapid way? If it's okay, let me take this question. And because I spend a lot of time in refining before this, but then Ben, Michael, I want you guys to jump in here. One of the things, and we've seen this a lot, you'll hear a lot about dashboards, right? And there's that's an easy term. People throw it around and like, I can get a dashboard for anything, right? And in the end, one of the things that I pick on that is because we've seen inside some facilities that the ability to look at information, I hate to say real time, but near real time, the access to say, hey, how does, if I push this cheaper crude slate through this refinery, or if I'm going to switch the feedstock from reformulated gas to natural gas, or from recycled gas to natural gas, as I look at making changes, can I understand the economic impact and the reliability impact real time? We know that that's becoming possible. But I would say that is something that some facilities are getting to, at least in the refining space, that's enabling plant managers, it's enabling operations folks to make those decisions more real time, knowing, yes, I can run this cheaper crude slate, but it's got higher acid, higher sulfur, and I know it's going to have this reliability impact, or at least I know it's going to increase uncertainty in a way that we didn't understand before. So we've known this because we've talked about dashboards for 20 years. But now being able to see that data come in and compare that real time is something that is happening. People are doing it. I know Pinnacle is seeing it with its customers. And so that's how I would answer that question. Ben, do you have an answer to that question? How do you integrate reliability considerations with throughput, with changes in feedstocks, those sort of things, kind of real-time decision-making?
I think that question was kind of framed up for a different industry, I suspect. I'd say that being able to look at, okay, so but you typically 5-year budget projections are set in the water industry, and they used to be set with a static data set. They'd look at how was our last year, and we're going to try and project that 5 years into the future and make operational and capital decisions on that. Now with going back to the digital transformation a little bit, hope this is still answering his question, is that we're able to utilize closer to real-time information and make better decisions about the future of where our dollars should be going and how we should be planning capital improvements over time using that.
Michael?
Yeah, we see this a lot in mining and other industries as well. We have variable productions. I think one of the coolest things about mining is that unlike maybe crude slates where you make a key decision at some point, mining feedstocks can change day to day, month to month, depending on what you mine, right? And you have some geology reports, but basically you've got your value chain of your production facility. And what you can see is, hey, on Wednesday, we wound up pushing through a harder ore grit. Hey guys, down in the smelter refiner, it's coming to you in about 2 or 3 days. It'll come through the stockpile. Get ready for that. Having people in that facility, having that information, feeding to them in a real enough time basis, and then having that team all aligned and looking at the same kind of impacts of going, if this feedstock changes, what do we need to do from an operation standpoint? Okay, if we change this operation, what does that do from a reliability and maintainability standpoint? Are we damaging the equipment? Do we need to run it through lower production rates as a result? Do I need to spin up the auxiliary units to handle excess gases that weren't running before? And what's the cost of spinning that up versus just having a little bit more corrosion in those assets in the short term where they're at? Those kinds of decisions, to what you're both saying, is critical to be able to have key stakeholders, plant managers, operations leaders in a room and go, let's pull up the board, let's make some decisions, and let's see what the forecast looks like. Let's crystal ball A, crystal ball B right next to each other and make an informed decision through that.
Great. Last question here, and then Jeff, I want you to take this one. How do you foresee that increasing emphasis on compliance, this is from Kavan, I think. How do you foresee that increasing emphasis on compliance and sustainability would impact the economy of reliability in the future? Take the oil and gas industry as an example.
It's a fantastic question. It's maybe the question of our times, frankly. And yes, we've talked about that considerably internally, and of course, there's an important conversation taking place externally. The answer is that if anything, reliability is going to become increasingly important going forward for exactly the reasons you said. There's increased attention being paid to compliance. There's a broader transformation taking place around energy that's feeding into sustainability issues. And so reliability, the value of high performance in the realm of reliability becomes even more important in every domain. And so that's part of the reason, again, that we found the motivation to do these kind of analyses and publish this series of reports is reliability will contend sort of always been overlooked, underutilized. There's immense opportunity to go capture and has been for quite a while. And that opportunity is only going to grow in the future, largely because of these compliance and sustainability concerns.
Well, and I'm going to take this one. We've got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to close out here with a bit of an anecdote that speaks directly to this issue. There's an interesting sort of broad conversation that Jeff mentioned that has to do with economics and are we going away from oil and gas? Are we going to see that in another 5 years it's all electric vehicles and nobody's using oil and gas anymore? And yet, if you look at the economics, you get out of the politics, you ask economists around the globe, what's the real trajectory of oil and gas operations? Everyone says we're going to be on oil and gas as our primary energy source probably for the next 25 years. Yes, what you call renewables or non-traditional energy sources are going to grow disproportionately to the other energy sources, and some energy sources like coal are particularly challenged. That said, the planet has a massive amount of infrastructure that today is based on the foundations of oil and gas. Now, that said, when you're entering a challenging market environment, there's less growth coming, there's less increase in demand as a on a per capita basis, that does mean economic challenges. And what we've seen, and I've read Jeff's reports, participated in them, is that those who are the most reliable are also the most economically advantaged. So in the challenging environment where, man, the margins are slim, well, those who are the most reliable operators can sustain through those slim margin environments. Those who are not, cannot. One of my largest takeaways from these three reports was in the refining report, in the difference in the graph that showed independent refiners. And you showed the best independent refiners, and you showed the largest, the sort of worst or the most expensive independent refiners. The amount of money, the difference in money spent on reliability across refining was dramatic. And so when you look and say, well, who's going to weather the storm of the difficult economics that are coming? It's going to be those who are most reliable. I think Jeff is right. We're going to see that becomes an even harder lever that people lean into, not just let's be more reliable, but if we're going to do this digital transformation and leverage data even more, reliability may be the single thing that we try to achieve the most advances in. My last thing is an anecdote for an industry we didn't talk about today. I was recently asked to go visit a forest products facility. In fact, it was a lumber mill, bringing in trees and sending boards out the back end. And as most of us know, the lumber prices have been at record highs for the last 6 months. They've come down now, but for the last 6 months, you had numbers no one had ever seen before. Go into a Home Depot or a Lowe's and pay $10 for a 2x4 that had cost $1.60 not a year earlier. And when you went into this lumber mill, what was interesting was in a highly machine operation, one that was not a process fluid, but mechanical things operating all the time, they saw the impacts of reliability in days, not months or years. And what was striking to me about it was not that they saw impacts, because I think that arguably their level of impact was still an order of magnitude smaller than large scale facilities like mines and oil and gas operations. The differences were that they saw them immediately. If they made reliability changes today, literally in a month, they would be more profitable. And I think we're going to see pop up in some non-traditional industries, opportunities to see big gains that might teach the more traditional, the large scale complex facilities, some interesting lessons. So I'm excited to see a continued push from our team and the economics of reliability reports and see what things we can learn, not just within the verticals that we live today, but across verticals that we've never seen before. I'm Ryan Sitton. Tune in next time for our new episode on the economics of reliability. Thanks for your questions, and we'll see you soon.